Dawn broke over Debden Airfield on March 6, 1944, as Colonel Donald Blakeslee climbed into his P-51 Mustang at 7:42 a.m. What he was about to attempt, the Luftwaffe had dismissed as fantasy. His destination, Berlin, 560 miles deep into the Reich's heartland. German intelligence had repeatedly assured their command that American single-engine fighters lacked the fuel capacity to reach their capital and return home safely. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. A 1,100-mile round trip exceeded every fighter America had fielded. The P-47 Thunderbolt ran dry hundreds of miles short. The P-38 Lightning faced the same fatal limitation. German fighter pilots operated with complete confidence in this intelligence, positioning themselves just beyond escort range before savaging the defenseless bomber streams. The cost had become catastrophic. American heavy bombers were falling from German skies at rates that threatened the entire daylight campaign. Schweinfurt, October 1943, 60 B-17 flying fortresses obliterated in a single mission, 1/5 of the attacking force simply erased. The strategic bombing effort was hemorrhaging crews faster than replacement training could compensate. But Blakeslee's Mustang carried something German strategists refused to believe existed. Mounted beneath each wing, a 108-gallon drop tank. British-manufactured paper fuel cells that extended his combat radius to 850 miles. Combined with the fuselage tank holding 85 gallons and his standard wing tanks, the P-51 possessed sufficient fuel to penetrate to Berlin, engage in 20 minutes of aerial combat, and navigate home. The Luftwaffe High Command had calculated this impossible. Their intelligence apparatus had confirmed it impossible. Their pilots had been briefed it would never happen. They were catastrophically wrong. At 26, Blakeslee was already a combat veteran of extraordinary experience. His war against Germany began in 1941 with the RAF's Eagle Squadron, continuing when he transferred to the USAAF's 4th Fighter Group. Over 500 combat missions, more than any American pilot flying, had taught him the brutal cost of sending bombers beyond fighter protection. He'd witnessed too many B-17 disintegrating in flames because escorts hit their fuel limits and had no choice but to abandon them. Now for the first time he would take single-engine fighters all the way to Hitler's capital. What unfolded over the next 7 hours would fundamentally rewrite the strategic equation of the European air war. The first crew, the 4th Fighter Group, couldn't protect due to fuel constraints was Lieutenant Robert Harriman's B-17 on August 17, 1943. Harriman had spent 2 months in England. His crew had survived 6 missions over occupied territory. Their target that day, the ball-bearing manufacturing complex at Schweinfurt, buried deep in German industrial heartland. P-47 shepherded them to the German frontier, then physics took over. They simply didn't carry enough fuel to continue. The Luftwaffe knew this with absolute precision. They'd been tracking American escort radius for months, calculating exact coordinates where protection would evaporate. German fighter controllers observed the P-47s banking westward toward England, then transmitted attack orders. Over 300 Messerschmitt Bf 10-9s and Focke-Wulf 190s descended on the unprotected formations. Harriman's B-17 absorbed cannon fire in the No. 3 engine 20 minutes after losing escort coverage. The engine ignited. Despite feathering the propeller, the crew couldn't extinguish the flames consuming their aircraft. 2 more German fighters attacked from directly behind, stitching cannon shells through the fuselage length. The tail assembly separated. The bomber tumbled earthward, spinning violently. 3 crew members escaped. 7 perished with the aircraft. 36 bombers didn't return from that mission. 260 men killed or captured, every single loss occurring beyond the protective umbrella American fighters could provide. The second crew was Captain James O'Connor's B-24, lost September 6th near Stuttgart. O'Connor commanded a flight element, an experienced leader with 14 completed missions. His formation targeted the Robert Bosch magneto manufacturing facility at Feuerbach. P-38s escorted as far as their fuel tanks permitted, approximately 400 miles from English bases. Then they too had to turn back. The Luftwaffe struck 30 seconds later. O'Connor's crew radioed they were engaging 15 to 20 enemy fighters. They called for reinforcements. None existed. They were isolated 150 miles inside German airspace, 40 bombers facing 300 interceptors. Multiple 20-millimeter cannon rounds shredded O'Connor's aircraft. The right-wing fuel tank detonated. The bomber inverted and plunged straight down from 22,000 feet. No parachutes were observed. 10 men died. By October 1943, the 8th Air Force had hemorrhaged 194 heavy bombers in 3 months. The overwhelming majority fell after escorts exhausted their fuel and withdrew. Crews called it flying naked, operating without fighter coverage. German pilots called it happy hunting time. They understood exactly where American protection ended. They positioned interceptor formations precisely beyond that boundary and waited. When American escorts banked toward home, Germans attacked with overwhelming numerical superiority. Bombers attempted self-defense with .50 caliber machine guns, but defensive fire couldn't stop a determined Luftwaffe pilot executing a head-on attack at 400 miles per hour. Bomber crews were dying faster than training programs could replace them. The situation had become operationally unsustainable. The catastrophic nadir arrived with the second Schweinfurt raid, October 14, 1943. 320 heavy bombers attacked the ball-bearing factories. 60 were destroyed, 600 men killed or captured in a single day's operations. 17 additional bombers were damaged beyond economical repair. Another 100 sustained serious damage requiring extensive reconstruction. The total loss rate touched 29%. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the entire United States Army Air Forces, ordered an immediate suspension of deep penetration missions. The losses were strategically unbearable. Bomber crews were physically and psychologically exhausted. Replacement pilots were arriving with inadequate preparation and dying on their first or second combat sorties. Something fundamental had to change. Without long-range fighter protection, daylight strategic bombing couldn't continue. Without daylight strategic bombing, the planned invasion of continental Europe faced potential failure. Germany would gain precious time to reinforce Atlantic defenses, manufacture more weapons, train additional pilots. The war could extend for years beyond current projections. More American soldiers would die on French beaches if the Luftwaffe wasn't first systematically destroyed from the air. The fundamental problem wasn't bomber range. B-17s and B-24s could strike any target across Germany. The problem was they couldn't survive concentrated German fighter opposition without escort protection, and no American fighter possessed the range to escort them throughout entire missions to distant targets and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt offered roughly 230 miles combat radius on internal fuel, extending to approximately 375 miles with external drop tanks. Sufficient for Western German targets, but nowhere near adequate for Berlin, the Ruhr industrial region, or critical petroleum refineries and aircraft manufacturing facilities deep inside the Reich. The P-38 Lightning provided better range, approximately 450 miles combat radius, but suffered crippling problems in the frigid temperatures at high altitude over Europe. Turbocharger systems failed with alarming regularity. Pilots coined the phrase, getting P-38'd when both engines quit simultaneously at 30,000 feet. Additionally, Lightning production never met demand. Sufficient P-38s to provide adequate escort coverage simply didn't exist. The Spitfire, flown by RAF squadrons, delivered exceptional performance but insufficient range. Even with drop tanks, it barely reached Paris. British fighters couldn't protect American bombers deep inside Germany. Bomber crews flew missions with absolute knowledge that significant portions of each flight would occur without protection, completely vulnerable. They watched German fighters positioning themselves at the exact limit of American escort range, circling, waiting. Crews could see them up there, predators counting down minutes until American fighters had no choice but to depart. Then the attacks commenced. Wave after relentless wave, German fighters diving through the formations, firing 20-millimeter cannons and 30-millimeter guns, shredding the unarmored bombers, killing the crews inside. A flying fortress could absorb tremendous punishment and continue flying, but sufficient hits would bring down anything. German pilots knew precisely where to aim: cockpit, engines, wing fuel tanks. They'd been destroying bombers for 2 years. They were exceptionally proficient. December 20th, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group arrived in England with new aircraft, the P-51B Mustang. The Mustang's development had been rushed and unconventional. April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation, requesting they manufacture P-40 Warhawks under license. North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, proposed a counteroffer. His company could design and construct a completely new fighter in the identical time frame. The British agreed, skeptical but desperate for aircraft production. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, led an engineering team that completed the entire aircraft design in 117 days. The prototype flew October 1940, designated NA-73 by the company, named Mustang by the British. Early Mustangs utilized Allison engines and were relegated to low-altitude tactical reconnaissance duties. They possessed superb handling characteristics and exceptional range, but the Allison engine's performance deteriorated dramatically above 15,000 feet. They couldn't compete with German fighters at the 20,000 to 30,000 foot altitudes where bomber formations operated, altitudes where thin air and turbocharging became essential. The RAF employed them for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance, roles where low-altitude performance mattered more than high-altitude capability. Then someone had a breakthrough idea. Ronald Harker, a Rolls-Royce test pilot, flew a Mustang in April 1942 and immediately recognized untapped potential. The airframe was outstanding, the aerodynamics were exceptional, but the engine was fundamentally wrong for the mission profile. Harker authored a report suggesting that replacing the Allison engine with a Rolls-Royce Merlin would transform the aircraft's high-altitude performance. The Merlin 61 engine featured a 2-stage supercharger maintaining power output to 30,000 feet and beyond. Combined with the Mustang's clean aerodynamic design and substantial fuel capacity, a Merlin-powered Mustang might become the long-range, high-altitude fighter everyone desperately needed. The British took this recommendation seriously. They shipped 5 Mustang airframes to Rolls-Royce for engine conversion. The results exceeded all expectations. With the Merlin engine, the Mustang's top speed increased from 365 miles per hour to 441 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Climb rate improved dramatically. Service ceiling jumped from 31,000 feet to 42,000 feet. The aircraft transformed from a capable low-altitude fighter into an exceptional high-altitude interceptor. North American initiated production of Merlin-powered Mustangs in 1943, designated P-51B and P-51C models. The engine was licensed manufactured by Packard in America, designated V1650. The airframe remained essentially unchanged from the original design. The fuel capacity was extraordinary for a single-engine fighter. Internal capacity started at 184 gallons in wing tanks, later increased to 269 gallons when an 85-gallon fuselage tank was added behind the pilot during production. With 2 108-gallon drop tanks, total fuel capacity reached 400 gallons. The P-51B could fly at 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It could climb to 30,000 feet in under 8 minutes. It could turn with a BF-109, dive with a FW-190, and most critically, carry enough fuel to fly for over 6 hours. With internal fuel alone, the P-51B offered roughly 475 miles combat radius. With 2 108-gallon drop tanks, the radius extended to 850 miles. That was sufficient. That was finally sufficient to reach Berlin. But the extra fuel created a serious problem. The P-51B's fuselage tank was positioned behind the pilot, aft of the center of gravity. When fully loaded with 85 gallons, the aircraft became dangerously unstable in pitch. Test pilots reported that with a full fuselage tank, violent pullouts or hard turns caused control stick loads to reverse, meaning pilots had to push forward on the stick to prevent the nose from pitching up further. The aircraft wanted to tumble. With a full fuselage tank, a P-51B couldn't dogfight. It could barely maneuver safely. The solution was burning fuselage tank fuel first before entering combat. Pilots received instructions to utilize the fuselage tank during climb-out and cruise, keeping the aircraft stable by the time they reached enemy territory. Once the fuselage tank was empty or nearly empty, the center of gravity shifted forward and the aircraft handled normally. But this demanded meticulous fuel management. Pilots had to monitor consumption constantly, switching tanks at precisely the right moments, calculating range to target, time available for combat, fuel required for return flight. One miscalculation meant running out of fuel over Germany. The 354th Fighter Group flew its first P-51 escort mission December 5, 1943. They escorted bombers to Amiens, France. December 11th, they escorted to Emden. December 13th, to Kiel. The Kiel mission penetrated 480 miles into Germany, the deepest penetration by American single-engine fighters to that date. The Luftwaffe responded aggressively. They sent up over 200 fighters to intercept. The 354th shot down 8 German aircraft and lost none of their own. The P-51 worked. It could fly deep into Germany, fight, and return home. Major General James Doolittle, who had just assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, saw the potential immediately. He needed that aircraft. He needed hundreds of them. The strategic bombing campaign's success depended on destroying the Luftwaffe's fighter force. The only way to accomplish that was forcing them into combat where American fighters could destroy them, and the only way to force them into combat was attacking targets the Germans had no choice but to defend. Targets deep inside Germany, targets like Berlin. But attacking Berlin required long-range fighters, required P-51s. Doolittle began converting fighter groups from P-47s to P-51s as quickly as aircraft became available. The 4th Fighter Group was next. Colonel Donald Blakeslee, who had been assigned to the 354 in December to assist their transition to combat operations, returned to the 4th in January as the new group commander. He wanted his group equipped with Mustangs. He pushed relentlessly. Major General William Kepner, commander of the 8th Fighter Command, was reluctant. Converting a fighter group to new aircraft required taking the entire group off operations for weeks, while pilots and ground crews learned new systems. Kepner couldn't afford to lose a complete fighter group during the build-up to the planned invasion of France. Blakeslee made him an offer. "Give me the P-51s, and I'll have the 4th Fighter Group operational within 24 hours. Kepner thought it was impossible. Blakeslee's pilots had been flying P-47s for over a year. They had no time in the P-51. The ground crews had no experience maintaining the Merlin engine. 24 hours wasn't enough time to convert an entire fighter group, Blakeslee insisted. His pilots had flown Spitfires with the Royal Air Force before transferring to the 8th. They knew the Merlin engine. They understood British systems. His mechanics had worked on Merlins for years. They could handle it. Kepner agreed, but with a condition. If the 4th Fighter Group wasn't fully operational within 24 hours, Blakeslee would be relieved of command. The 4th received their first P-51Bs on February 26, 1944. Blakeslee gathered his pilots and gave them their instructions. Learn to fly them on the way to the target. They would begin combat operations within 48 hours. Some pilots had less than 30 minutes of flight time in the P-51 before flying their first mission. The mechanics worked through the night, familiarizing themselves with the new aircraft, checking systems, loading ammunition, installing drop tanks. By February 28th, the 4th Fighter Group flew their first P-51 mission, escorting bombers to France. Every aircraft returned safely. Blakeslee had kept his promise. By early March 1944, the 8th Air Force possessed enough P-51s to attempt what had been impossible 6 months earlier. A daylight bombing raid on Berlin with fighter escort all the way to the target and back. The operation was approved. The mission was scheduled for March 3rd. Weather scrubbed it. They tried again March 4th. Weather was marginal but acceptable. Over 600 bombers took off, escorted by over 650 fighters, including the 4th Fighter Group's P-51s. It was the first large-scale American attack on Berlin. Blakeslee led his 48 Mustangs into the mission, briefing at 0500 hours. The map showed the route, northeast across the North Sea, over the Netherlands, across northern Germany, straight to Berlin. The bombers would strike industrial targets in the city. The fighters would provide continuous escort from takeoff to landing. No bomber would fly unescorted. Weather forecast called for scattered clouds over the target. visibility 3 to 5 miles. German fighter opposition was expected to be heavy. The Luftwaffe would defend Berlin with everything available. Intelligence estimated 300 to 400 German fighters would be airborne. The American fighters would be outnumbered in the target area, but they would have the advantage of altitude and position. The bombers would bomb from 24,000 to 26,000 feet. The fighters would fly top cover at 30,000 feet, positioned between the bombers and the sun, forcing any attacking German fighters to climb through the escort screen. Fuel management was critical. Pilots were instructed to burn their fuselage tanks to below 40 gallons before crossing into German territory. Drop tanks would be jettisoned when empty or when combat was imminent. Each pilot was responsible for monitoring his own fuel state and calculating his own return fuel requirements. No one would be left behind, but any pilot who ran out of fuel over Germany was on his own. The nearest friendly territory was the Netherlands, over 200 miles from Berlin. A P-51 could glide maybe 30 miles with no engine power. The math was clear. If you ran out of fuel over Berlin, you were not going home. The 4th Fighter Group took off at 0742, 48 Mustangs, each loaded with two 108-gallon drop tanks, full ammunition, and enough fuel to reach Berlin and fight. The aircraft were heavy. Taking off at maximum gross weight required careful technique. Too much throttle and the torque would pull the aircraft off the runway. Too little and the aircraft wouldn't accelerate fast enough to become airborne before running out of runway. Blakeslee's Mustang lifted off after using 3/4 of the runway. He climbed to 1,000 feet, circled once, and watched his 3 squadrons form up behind him. 48 aircraft in tight formation, silver Mustangs against the gray English morning. They set course for the North Sea. The flight to Germany took 2.5 hours. The bombers were already ahead, strung out in a formation 70 miles long. Over 600 heavy bombers carrying thousands of tons of explosives toward the Nazi capital. The 4th Fighter Group rendezvoused with their assigned bomber group over the Netherlands at 0915, exactly on schedule. Blakeslee positioned his fighters in a combat spread formation 5,000 feet above the bombers, weaving back and forth to maintain position. The bombers flew straight and level, maintaining formation discipline. Below, the Dutch countryside passed by, fields and rivers and small towns. Ahead, Germany waited. They crossed the border at 0935. The first contrails appeared, high-altitude German fighters positioning for attack. Blakeslee counted at least 40, maybe 50. More appeared every minute, climbing from airfields scattered across northern Germany. The Luftwaffe had scrambled everything they had. Blakeslee called out the contacts on the radio. Bogies 11 o'clock high, 20 plus. Bogies 1 o'clock level, 20 plus. Bandits forming up ahead, estimate 50 plus. His pilots acknowledged. Everyone saw them. The Germans were massing for a coordinated attack. At 0958, the first German fighters dove toward the bombers. Blakeslee called out, "Here they come. Break left and engage." The 4th Fighter Group turned into the attack. What followed was 7 minutes of violent aerial combat. Bf-109S and FW-190S tried to break through the escort screen. The P-51s blocked them, turning inside their attacks, firing in deflection, forcing the Germans to break off or die. Blakeslee shot at a Bf-109, but his guns jammed after 2 seconds. He continued flying anyway, positioning his aircraft to force German fighters into positions where his wingmen could shoot them. Squadron Commander Major James Goodson destroyed 2 FW-19s in quick succession. Captain Don Gentile got a Bf-109 from 200 yards range, watched it explode across the sky. Aircraft twisted and dove, guns firing, shells hitting, aircraft smoking. The radio chatter was constant. "Break right. Bandit on your 6. Got him. 2 more at 3 o'clock. Watch the one below." Blakeslee kept his squadron together, maintained position over the bombers, denied the Germans a clear shot. The German fighters tried to get past the escorts, tried to reach the bombers, but the Mustangs blocked every approach. Finally, low on fuel and ammunition, the German fighters broke off and dove away. The 4th Fighter Group had lost none of their own and had shot down 5 confirmed German aircraft. More importantly, every bomber in their assigned group reached the target safely. Over Berlin, the sky filled with flak. Thousands of German anti-aircraft guns firing upward, filling the air with exploding steel. The bombers flew through it, holding formation, opening their bomb bay doors. 10,000 feet below, Berlin spread across the landscape, gray buildings and streets, and the winding Spree River. The bombers released their bombs, thousands of bombs falling, trailing smoke, disappearing into the city below. Blakeslee watched from 30,000 feet, watched the explosions blossom across the city center, watched the smoke rise. Berlin was burning. The bombers turned west for the return flight. More German fighters appeared, trying to attack the damaged bombers straggling behind the formations. The P-51s stayed with them, defending, escorting all the way across Germany, across the Netherlands, until they reached the North Sea in safety. The mission took 6 hours and 40 minutes from takeoff to landing. Blakeslee landed at Debden at 1400 hours with 20 gallons of fuel remaining, barely enough for 10 minutes of flight. Every aircraft of the 4th Fighter Group returned. Not one bomber they escorted was shot down by German fighters. What none of the Americans realized was that on the ground in Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was watching from his headquarters. He saw the contrails of American fighters over the city. He had been told it was impossible. His intelligence officers had calculated that no American single-engine fighter had the range to reach Berlin. His engineers had examined captured P-47s and P-38s and concluded that neither aircraft could fly that far. His fighter controllers had assured him that American bomber raids would always be vulnerable beyond escort range. They were all wrong. When Göring saw P-51s flying over Berlin, escorting the bombers, he understood immediately what it meant. The strategic balance had shifted. The Americans could now bomb any target in Germany with fighter escort. There was nowhere left to hide. The Luftwaffe would have to fight over their own cities, over their own factories, over their own airfields. They would be fighting at the end of supply lines stretched to breaking, with inadequate fuel, with poorly trained replacement pilots, against an enemy with numerical superiority and better equipment. It was, Göring later admitted, the moment he knew Germany would lose the air war. The Americans returned to Berlin on March 6th. This time, 800 bombers attacked, escorted by over 900 fighters. The 4th Fighter Group flew again. Blakeslee led them back to the capital. This time, the Luftwaffe was ready. They had pulled fighters from the Eastern Front, from Italy, from everywhere they could find them. Over 350 German fighters were airborne when the Americans arrived. The battle that followed became known as Black Monday. It was one of the largest air battles ever fought over Europe. The 4th Fighter Group encountered German fighters 50 miles from Berlin. The Luftwaffe had changed tactics. Instead of attacking the bombers directly, they focused on destroying the fighter escorts first. If they could eliminate the P-51s, the bombers would be vulnerable. Wave after wave of Bf-109s and FW-190s dove through the American fighter formations, trying to break them up, scatter them, eliminate the cohesive escort coverage. The American pilots fought back. Major James Goodson destroyed 2 German fighters. Lieutenant Howard Hively engaged multiple enemy aircraft. Across the entire 8th Fighter Command, American pilots fought intensely. The Luftwaffe lost between 66 and 81 aircraft according to German loss records, though American wartime claims were higher due to multiple pilots claiming the same kills. The Germans inflicted casualties too. 69 American bombers were shot down, 53 B-17 and 16 B-24. 11 American fighters were lost, including 4 from the 4th Fighter Group. The losses were heavy, but the mission was a success. The bombers reached their targets. Berlin was bombed again, and most importantly, the presence of P-51s over Berlin was now undeniable. The Germans could no longer claim it was a mistake or a fluke. American single-engine fighters had flown to Berlin twice in 3 days. The impossible had become routine. German fighter pilots first understood the strategic implications on March 8th, 2 days after Black Monday. The 4th Fighter Group returned to Berlin, this time targeting the Erkner ball-bearing works in the city's southwest suburbs. On this mission, Captain Don Gentile and his wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, pioneered new aggressive tactics. Gentile shot down 3 Bf-10-9s in a single engagement, bringing his total to approximately 14 confirmed victories. Together with Godfrey, they claimed 6 enemy aircraft that day, demonstrating that P-51s could not only escort bombers to Berlin, but could dominate German fighters in combat over the Nazi capital. Gentile would eventually be credited with 19.83 aerial victories plus 6 aircraft destroyed on the ground, making him one of the war's leading aces. Luftwaffe Major Günther Röhl, credited with 275 victories on the Eastern Front, flew his first mission defending Berlin during this period. He encountered P-51s at 28,000 feet directly over the city. Röhl was an experienced pilot, a recipient of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's most skilled fighter commanders. He knew aircraft performance, knew fuel consumption calculations, knew what should be possible and what shouldn't. When he saw P-51s over Berlin, hundreds of miles from England, he immediately understood that something fundamental had changed. After landing, he told his squadron, "The Americans have solved the range problem. They can escort their bombers anywhere now. We can't hide anymore. We'll have to fight them over every target in Germany." Other German pilots reported similar realizations. Johannes Steinhoff, another experienced ace, flew against P-51s near Berlin on March 9th. He tried the standard Luftwaffe tactic, diving through the fighter screen at high speed, ignoring the escorts, trying to reach the bombers. The P-51s followed him down, caught him at 15,000 feet, forced him into a turning fight. Steinhoff was flying a FW-190, an excellent aircraft at low altitude, but the P-51 turned with him, stayed on his tail, fired repeatedly. Steinhoff escaped only by diving to the treetops and running at maximum speed. He landed with bullet holes in his rudder and elevator. He told his ground crew, "That Mustang followed me all the way down and stayed with me in the turn. I couldn't shake him. We can't outturn them. We can't outdive them, and they can fly farther than we can. I don't know how we're supposed to beat them." The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was severe. For 3 years, they had owned the sky over Germany. They knew that beyond a certain point, American fighter escorts would have to turn back, and the bombers would be vulnerable. That knowledge gave them confidence, allowed them to plan their attacks, to position their formations at exactly the right point to maximize their advantages. Now that advantage was gone. American fighters could be anywhere, at any altitude, at any distance from England. German pilots could no longer predict where the escorts would turn back because they weren't turning back. The rules had changed. German fighter commanders tried to adapt. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, ordered his pilots to focus on the bombers and ignore the fighters whenever possible. The mission was to stop the bombs, not to achieve a favorable kill ratio against enemy fighters. But that strategy was nearly impossible to execute. The P-51s positioned themselves between the German fighters and the bombers. Any attack on the bombers meant fighting through the escorts first, and fighting P-51s meant casualties. The aircraft was faster than the Bf-109 at altitude, could turn with the FW-190, and was more heavily armed than either. Worse, there were hundreds of them. The Americans seemed to have an unlimited supply. Every mission, more P-51s appeared. The Luftwaffe was outnumbered, outranged, and increasingly outfought. German intelligence tried to determine how the Americans had achieved the range increase. They examined wreckage from downed P-51s, looking for modified fuel systems, enlarged tanks, anything that would explain the impossible range. They found the drop tanks, of course, the 108-gallon paper tanks manufactured by Bowater Scott in Britain. German engineers calculated the additional range provided by the drop tanks and realized the truth. The P-51 had been designed from the beginning with exceptionally large internal fuel capacity. The drop tanks merely extended an already impressive range. There was no secret modification, no revolutionary technology. The Americans had simply built a fighter with enough fuel capacity to escort bombers anywhere in Europe. The Germans had never considered it possible. Their own long-range fighter projects, the Bf-110, the Me-210, had all focused on twin-engine designs. They had assumed a single-engine fighter couldn't carry enough fuel for strategic range. They were wrong. By the end of March 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost over 400 fighter pilots killed or seriously wounded. Most were lost in battles over Germany, fighting against escorted bomber raids. The P-51 had forced the Luftwaffe to fight at a time and place of American choosing, and the casualties were unsustainable. Replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with less than 200 hours total flight time. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages were becoming critical as American bombers destroyed synthetic fuel plants across Germany. Aircraft production was still high, but there weren't enough trained pilots to fly them. Galland reported to Göring that the fighter force was being destroyed. He needed more aircraft, more pilots, more fuel, and most of all, more time to train replacements properly. Göring had no solutions. Hitler demanded that the Luftwaffe stop the bombing raids, but provided no additional resources. The industrial capacity simply didn't exist anymore. The factories were being bombed. The synthetic fuel plants were being destroyed. The transportation system was breaking down, and over all of it, P-51s circled, shooting down any German fighter that tried to interfere. The strategic impact became clear by April 1944. The 8th Air Force had achieved air superiority over most of Germany. Bomber losses dropped from 8% per mission in October 1943 to less than 2% in April 1944. The P-51 was primarily responsible. With continuous fighter escort, bombers could attack any target in daylight with acceptable losses. The Luftwaffe could still inflict casualties, but they couldn't stop the raids. Germany's war production was being systematically destroyed, and there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do about it. In April 1944, 8th Fighter Command expanded operations to include aggressive fighter sweeps ahead of the bomber formations. The P-51s would take off early, fly directly to German airfields and strafe aircraft on the ground before they could take off to intercept the bombers. The tactic was devastating. German fighters were destroyed on the ground by the dozens. Airfields were cratered, fuel dumps burned, maintenance facilities destroyed. The Luftwaffe was being attacked at its source. The 4th Fighter Group participated in these operations throughout April and May. They strafed airfields across Germany, destroying aircraft on the ground and in the air. The aggressive tactics worked. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing more aircraft on the ground than in the air. The cost was not insignificant. Low-level strafing was dangerous. German airfields were heavily defended with anti-aircraft guns. P-51s were hit regularly. Some were shot down, their pilots killed or captured, but the exchange ratio favored the Americans overwhelmingly. For every P-51 lost, the Germans lost 10 or more aircraft on the ground, plus trained pilots who might have been killed when their aircraft exploded during the strafing run. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe's day fighter force was a shadow of what it had been a year earlier. On D-Day, June 6th, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe managed only 100 sorties over the invasion beaches. The Allies flew over 14,000. German pilots who tried to attack the invasion fleet were shot down immediately by overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Western Europe. The P-51 had made that possible. Without the long-range escort capability, the strategic bombing campaign would have failed. Without the strategic bombing campaign succeeding, air superiority over France would not have been achieved. Without air superiority, the D-Day invasion would have faced catastrophically higher casualties and might have failed entirely. After the war, Hermann Göring was interrogated by American intelligence officers. They asked him what factors had led to Germany's defeat in the air. Göring's answer was direct and documented in official United States Army Air Force's interrogation records. Long-range fighters were the most decisive factor in the air war. He stated that deep bomber penetrations were only possible with long-range escort, and that this capability came as a complete surprise to the Luftwaffe. When fighters appeared over Berlin for the first time, Göring admitted he knew the eventual results would be tragic for Germany. The strategic air offensive could continue indefinitely, and the Luftwaffe lacked the resources to stop it. The mechanics who maintained the P-51s rarely received recognition. Their names don't appear in history books, but they worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, keeping the aircraft flying. They changed engines in the rain. They repaired battle damage in freezing temperatures. They loaded ammunition at dawn so the missions could take off on time. Each aircraft required constant maintenance. The Merlin engine needed oil changes every 25 flying hours. Spark plugs fouled and required replacement regularly. The coolant system developed leaks that had to be sealed. The ammunition belts for the .50 caliber machine guns had to be loaded by hand. 6 guns, 1,800 rounds per aircraft. Every single round inspected and loaded into the belts that fed into the wing guns. Drop tanks had to be installed, fuel lines connected, electrical systems tested, every control surface checked for proper movement, every tire inspected for wear, every hydraulic line examined for leaks. The work never stopped. A typical maintenance shift began at 0400 hours. The mechanics arrived in the dark, used flashlights to conduct pre-flight inspections, started engines to check for oil leaks and unusual sounds, tested magnetos and generators, checked fuel quantities, armed the guns. By 0600, the aircraft had to be ready for the morning mission. If a pilot reported a problem during startup, the mechanics had minutes to diagnose and fix it, or the mission would be delayed. Delays meant bombers flew without escorts. Bombers without escorts meant dead crews. The mechanics understood the stakes. They worked fast, worked accurately, double-checked everything. After the aircraft took off, the mechanics cleaned up, inventoried spare parts, prepared for the inevitable repairs that would be needed when the aircraft returned. Battle damage was common. 20-millimeter cannon shells punched holes through aluminum skin. Machine gun bullets hit control surfaces, hydraulic lines, fuel tanks. Some damage could be patched quickly, aluminum sheets riveted over holes, control cables replaced, hydraulic lines repaired. Serious damage meant removing entire assemblies, wings, tail sections, engines, replacing them with spares if available, or cannibalizing parts from aircraft too damaged to repair. The mechanics became experts at improvisation, at making repairs with whatever materials were available, at keeping aircraft flying when by all engineering logic they should have been grounded. Crew chiefs worked in teams, each responsible for a specific aircraft and its pilot. They took pride in their work, knowing that mechanical failures could mean the difference between a pilot returning home or being lost over enemy territory. The ground crews at Debden worked continuously throughout 1944, maintaining the 4th Fighter Group's aircraft through thousands of combat missions. The long-range escort capability of the P-51 changed the fundamental strategic equation of the air war. Before the Mustang, unescorted bombers couldn't survive over Germany. After the Mustang, bombers could reach any target in Europe in daylight with acceptable losses. That capability allowed the combined bomber offensive to succeed, which in turn made the D-Day invasion possible. The P-51's range made air superiority achievable, and air superiority made victory inevitable. The aircraft proved that range was more important than raw performance, that the ability to fly to the target was more valuable than the ability to fly slightly faster or turn slightly tighter. The lessons influenced aircraft design for decades. Long range became a design priority. Every modern fighter aircraft emphasizes combat radius as a critical specification. The lineage traces directly back to the P-51. Colonel Blakeslee flew until October 1944, when he was grounded by direct order from 8th Fighter Command. He had accumulated over 1,000 combat hours, more than any American pilot in the war, and headquarters couldn't risk losing him. Blakeslee was devastated. He wanted to keep flying, to keep fighting, to be with his pilots until the war ended. But the order was final. He returned to the United States in November. The 4th Fighter Group continued fighting without him, adding to their total until they became the highest-scoring American fighter group in the European theater, with over 1,000 confirmed aerial victories. Blakeslee stayed in the Air Force, commanded a fighter wing in Korea, and retired as a colonel in 1965. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal Cross twice, the Silver Star twice, the Distinguished Flying Cross 7 times, and numerous other decorations. He never sought publicity for his accomplishments. When asked about the Berlin missions years later, he simply said, "We did what needed to be done." The P-51s continued escorting bombers until the last missions of the war in May 1945. By then, the Luftwaffe barely existed. Fuel shortages were so severe that many German fighters couldn't take off. The pilots who did fly were mostly inexperienced replacements, killed on their first or second missions by American pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience. The air war was over. The P-51 had won it, not through superior speed or firepower, but through the simple ability to be there, to fly far enough to escort bombers to any target and bring them home again. In 1944, the Senate War Investigating Committee, chaired by Senator Harry Truman, called the P-51 the most aerodynamically perfect pursuit plane in existence. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, called the appearance of the Mustang over Germany one of the great miracles of the war. General Karl Spaatz, commander of United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, stated clearly that without the P-51, the strategic air offensive could not have succeeded. The bomber crews expressed it more simply. They called the P-51s little friends. When those silver fighters appeared on escort duty, bomber crews knew they had a chance to survive the mission. The presence of Mustangs meant hope. Wars are won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. The P-51 succeeded because thousands of individuals made it work. Pilots who flew 6-hour missions knowing one mistake meant death. Mechanics who worked through exhaustion keeping aircraft flying. Engineers who designed systems that functioned reliably under combat stress. Intelligence officers who planned routes that maximized range while minimizing risk. Factory workers who built 15,000 Mustangs in 3 years, test pilots who proved the aircraft's capabilities, instructors who trained replacement pilots. Everyone contributed to a system that in the end changed the outcome of the war. On March 6, 1944, Blakeslee didn't know he was making history. He was doing his job, protecting bombers, trying to keep his pilots alive. The fact that he was accomplishing what German intelligence said was impossible didn't matter in the moment. He saw enemy fighters, engaged them, defended the bombers, returned home. The historical significance only became clear later when analysts examined the data and realized what had happened. The Americans had solved the range problem. The escorts could go anywhere. The Luftwaffe had nowhere to hide. The strategic bombing campaign could continue until Germany's industrial capacity was destroyed. Air superiority was assured. The invasion could proceed. Victory became possible. For the German pilots who saw P-51s over Berlin that day, the implications were immediate. They understood instantly that the war had shifted. American fighters were flying deeper into Germany than should have been possible. The escorts weren't turning back anymore. Every target was now vulnerable to daylight attack. The Luftwaffe would have to defend everywhere at once, spreading their diminishing forces across an impossibly wide front. They would be fighting at the end of long supply lines with inadequate fuel, with poorly trained pilots against an enemy with numerical superiority and unlimited resources. The mathematics were clear. The Luftwaffe was being ground down through attrition, and there was no way to stop it. When those silver Mustangs appeared over the Nazi capital, circling at 30,000 feet, untouchable and unopposed, the outcome of the air war became certain. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to stay connected with history that matters. These stories shape the world we live in today, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Our community reaches across continents, connecting people who understand that history isn't just dates and names in textbooks. History is people making choices, taking risks, doing difficult things because they believed it mattered. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering.